Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. Joining me in this episode is Jennifer Giesbrecht, author of The Monster of Elendhaven. This dark fantasy novella follows the unkillable, not exactly human Johann as he slinks about the industrial-gothic city of Elendhaven. Johann murders and steals with unnatural anonymity until he develops an obsession with Florian, a prominent old money accountant who is, in fact, a sorcerer. Johann courts Florian's affection even as he becomes a puppet to the sorcerer's long-festering need for vengeance, and together they pursue a violent path that may tear them and their city apart. The Monster of Elendhaven is available September 24th from Tor.com Publishing. And Jennifer, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks for having me.
So you mentioned before we got started here, this is your first podcast interview?
Yeah.
This is your debut book, but you have been working and writing for a while, right? You know, before the publishing of this novel, you worked for a company called, is it What Pumpkin?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've written some short stories and stuff before this novella, but you also work with What Pumpkin on a pretty prominent project. What is that?
I've been working on Act 2 of Hive Swap, which is the adventure game prequel to a pretty popular comic called Homestuck. I also ghostwrote the Homestuck epilogue. For the vast majority of it, I had quite a bit of help, which was released earlier this year.
So Homestuck is one of those things that, I mean, me being a guy in his 40s kind of have missed the boat on, except for I kind of live at comic conventions. And so I would...
You've seen a lot of gray face paint.
Yes. And the horns and stuff or whatever too. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would keep seeing these characters appear over and over again. And I would ask people about it and be like, what is that? And they'd be like, oh, that's from Homestuck. And I might as well make the blinky GIF meme face that you see on Twitter all the time because I just had no idea what it was. Especially for a younger generation of people, that's had a big impact. So how did you get involved with that project?
I was a Homestuck fanfic author back in my last couple of years of university, but I actually got hired onto Homestuck through writing fan fiction for the Metal Gear games. I became friends with someone who works in Homestuck through my Metal Gear fanfic, and they put me in contact with Andrew Hussey because they thought that I was the right person to ghostwrite the epilogue, just because I have a very particular skill set where I have both a very strong voice as a writer, but I'm pretty good at shifting my writing so that it picks up on the tone of the work that I'm writing fanfic for. So it was kind of very perfectly suited to my skill set.
This will seem an odd aside, and you know, people who cannot see us as they listen to the audio of this will not be able to tell, but over on the shelf behind me, hiding back there, is a 16-inch Solid Snake, and then the original Metal Gear NES game cartridge sitting on the shelf back there. So yeah, you were speaking my language with the Metal Gear stuff there. That's awesome.
Incredible. There's actually a lot of weird similarities, I'd say, between Metal Gear and Homestuck. They both involve the reader in the narrative in very clever ways. And actually, I would say the Homestuck epilogue was a little bit like Metal Gear Solid 2 in that it was a very bizarre metatextual story that had a very rich non-literal meaning and a very, at points, stupid, I would almost say, main narrative. And I'm not shitting on either Metal Gear or Homestuck here. I'm very proud of my work on Homestuck, and I love Metal Gear a lot, but I am very interested in those kind of metatextual stories in which the meaning of it is more important than the literal action of it.
Oh yeah, I mean it's Hideo Kojima who did Metal Gear, and and his work is littered with those kinds of meta thinking and kind of pulling you out and a little bit of a wink and a nod, but also attempt to hit it much deeper kind of complex issues that you're not expecting, while at the same time, like Metal Gear Solid 2, having a character running around nude for an entire level of it, you know?
Yeah, it's a series that always takes the piss out of itself, which is something I appreciate about it.
Yeah. With this new book, then, so I feel like this is a little bit of a left turn from those things, although perhaps maybe it's been informed by those previous writing experiences. But with The Monster of Elendhaven, is it fair to call it a novella? Because it's about 150 pages, and I'm not sure what the industry technically considers that these days.
The industry considers it a novella.
Because it's 50,000 words? Is that kind of where it rounds out at?
Yeah, but at 47,000, I think. Yeah.
I gave the description at the top, kind of my view of what the story is, but can you kind of explain what this story is all about?
Well, I've been getting a lot of reviews calling it like gay Frankenstein, which is funny, but I think that it's accurate on a less flippant level, because Frankenstein, when you get down to it, Frankenstein is a work that is very much straddling the thought divide between the Enlightenment era and what we would call late modernity, by which I mean it's straddling that like area where like European society was losing faith in the idea of a world and humanity governed by natural laws, like God-given laws. And Frankenstein's novel grappled a lot about what humanity's place in that new godless, unmoored world is, which my novella has like a lot of the same themes. So I guess the pretentious high concept description I would give of Monster of Elendhaven is that it's a love story between two monsters of modernity.
I think it's interesting to call this a love story, or a lot of people refer to the romance. And I want to dig more into this later because I feel like there's...
You don't think it's romantic?
I mean, I found it very unsettling in a lot of places, but I'll swing back around to that. I want to know first, what was the earliest conception of the story? Like, where did this kind of concept germinate from, and how did it evolve into the final product?
I kind of wanted to do like a reverse Faust thing where like the demon is like the POV character who makes like a bad bargain with the researcher. And so it's kind of like, well, humanity in the story of Faust is always vying for this forbidden external knowledge. So I'm like, if we flip it and you sort of have like a monstrous character who is part of that natural world, wouldn't they be trying to find like forbidden internal knowledge? But that like fell apart pretty quickly because I'm not really interested in the themes of like divine punishment or salvation in Faust. Like, I studied history in university, and that's most of what I do is like read history and read like critical theory that has like a strong basis in like a historical analysis. So I have like a very materialist view of the world. So it was hard for me to try to write something with these kind of like lofty, like philosophical, like religious themes. So it just turned into what it eventually turned into. And I kind of had to like reapproach it when I was figuring out how to like reframe my second draft and sell it.
So, I mean, you mentioned there you've got this history background and interest, and I think that's a good thing to note here because this is, I would say it's secondary world, but the city of Eldenhaven has, I'd say, a familiarity to it in that sort of like oily Gothic industrial London that, you know, we sort of know from history and a lot of like movies and even like video games and stuff. And this is a separate place from that in many ways, but it definitely kind of touches on that feel, that like sort of London feel. What were the kind of the building blocks of the city in your world then, whether it's from the historical research and then whatever things you were expanding on it with?
Well, let me tell you the story of the city I live in. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I grew up here. It's a very small, quaint coastal city with really bad brain drain. You know, it's a beautiful historic city, but basically all the industries are dying. People are like fleeing. And about 100 years ago, we had this little incident in which our harbor, one of the deepest harbors in the world, was subject to the largest man-made explosion that was not caused by a nuclear weapon.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I didn't really realize it when I was writing it, but like looking back on sort of where Elendhaven came from, I'm like, oh, it's really weird that I wrote this like dreary coastal city that is just completely falling apart because it can't keep up with like the new industrial paradigm. And also it exploded a couple hundred years ago. I wonder where that inspiration came from. Yeah, so I basically was just writing like Fantasy My Hometown.
I did not know there was a gigantic explosion there or anything like that. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it was just, it was during World War I. So it was like two boats collided and one of them was like full of munitions.
Oh, so that wasn't good for anybody.
No.
It's kind of funny to laugh at now, but yeah, in retrospect, oh yeah, bad day for a whole lot of people, for sure. When I think of trying to explain the story, like it is this off-kilter, slightly whimsical, but also very dark, very grim world that has kind of like, I would think of as sort of Victorian era sort of manners and sort of the way people interact with each other. But it's also, like you said, it's sort of a city that's remaining still in a world that's starting to change around it. You've got this really lush sort of atmospheric writing going on with it to describe this world. It's one of the signature things that people are going to latch onto is that like you give this very rich experience of what that world is like. And in a 47,000 word novella, you could easily overtip the balance of story to description if you overdid that. How were you working to balance that out, and how much work was it to get that right alchemy of atmosphere with story?
actually wasn't any work at all. I always feel like I sounded like a little full of myself saying it, but I honestly just wrote it like that the first time. I think a lot harder about how to write very undecorative prose. So if I have to like move action really fast and like have very practical language, I find that very difficult to do. And that's where I kind of put a lot of thought into things. But when you're talking about like these florid descriptions, like those just kind of like flow out of me. I spend a lot of time thinking about how nice trees are while I like walk around and kind of like funnel that into my work.
So you have to rein that in whenever you're going into action and stuff. So that part of things, then, if you're trying to make things move swiftly or, speak with a sort of economy of prose, what are you using to remind yourself to trim it back? Or is that places where your editors are kind of like, oh, this is where we need things to flow a little bit easier? What would have been your methodology to tighten that up?
What I tend to do if I'm having a difficult time, like moving a scene quickly, is I think about it more like it's like a comic book, like a sequence of images, rather than trying to like situate someone in a scene for a long time, because it's more your word choice and sort of the length and like cadence of your sentences that make people feel like they're either situated for a while in a paragraph or make them feel like they're moving very quickly. I think a lot of people don't notice it when they read, but because I'm a writer, I notice when I'm reading fast and when I'm reading slow. Yeah, I tend to shift my thinking more towards like, well, how would I write this if I were trying to do like a screenplay or like a comic book to keep myself in that momentum as I'm writing?
Well, one of the things I did notice is that despite having a very descriptive prose style in this, the story moves. It moves very quickly. And without naming it, like earlier this week, I was reading another likely to be popular new release that was also highly descriptive, highly idiosyncratic in its language. And it took me as long to read 50 pages of that story as it took me to read 150 of yours.
Oh, wow.
And I would find myself getting bogged down in the prose sometimes where I'd have to reread passages in that other book multiple times because the sentences were longer, the text was denser, versus yours where, again, highly atmospheric, but no problem moving through it. Never felt like I was missing something as far as, what was going on. I still reread things all the time because I do that with every book that I do, because if I like a passage, I'm going to read it 3 times just to kind of savor the words of it. But it's nice for somebody like me who doesn't necessarily have as much reading time as I would like, that when I pick up a book, it gets up and moves. And so I really appreciated that in this one. Along with the setting, like I said at the top, there is a sorcerer in this. And this is a world where magic has kind of ravaged part of the world in the past and is not looked upon favorably with people in this world. I mean, sorcerers are essentially like outlawed and even hunted. So can you kind of talk about like that situation in this world and what the magic system kind of is? And then we'll come around and talk about Johann because he's something kind of unique within that.
Well, with the magic, I mean, this is a very short story, so it's definitely like a soft magic system. Like, I didn't sit down and do like the Brandon Sanderson of like trying to figure out like, the specific scientific way in which it works. So there was a scene where Florian describes it like the filament of a light bulb. And I meant that quite literally. It's like, what is electricity? It's something that is created by like the cosmology of Earth. But 99% of the time, we can't see it. And it took a very, very, very long time for like humans to even be able to channel it in a way that was useful. So in this world, magic is kind of like that. It's just a natural part of the cosmology, but only some people are born as conduits and can use it. So Florian is the filament in the light bulb. He is the thing that is channeling the magic into the world.
So, I mean, alongside of Florian, who's the sorcerer character, I mean, our main POV character is Johann, and he is human-ish, but certainly something different. And I don't want to give away too much of what that is, because certainly that's part of the mystery of the story about exactly what he is. But, can you kind of explain sort of his unique situation and how he operates within this world?
There's a line where Johann describes himself as being Elendhaven. He says that he is the city. And I sort of think of him as like a directionless black hole. He doesn't face any consequence for his actions. There's no stakes in anything he does. People have a hard time remembering him or even looking at him straight. So he almost becomes this like sponge that just soaks up all like the worst parts of a society that he sees because, he has no cultural clout. He lives like his entire life in the gutter and the shadows. And because he's a sponge that's only soaking up the grime, he almost becomes like this detached Greek chorus for the city. Like, that's why I think it's so important to have a character like this be funny, because there's a lot of just, like psychopathic murderers who are like Joker funny or who are like serious. But like he's like kind of wry and observational, even though he has almost this like innocent violence because he doesn't really understand like the full consequences of what he's doing. So he really is just a mirror held up to the city.
I like that you mentioned that he basically lives his life without consequence, because this is a character he's essentially not invulnerable. He can be hurt, but he is unkillable. He bounces back. He always heals from whatever happens with him. And like you said, he has this unnatural ability to go unnoticed by almost anybody except for those who have a particular magical affinity. At the beginning of the story, we see that he is a thing more than a person. He doesn't have a name. He has to give himself his own name, and he doesn't really see himself as a human being until he has that name. But yeah, exploring that idea of somebody who can steal and kill and take what he wants and kind of move through life very frivolously because there is no sense of consequence, while at the same time being an exceptionally observant person, because he's a mirror for the city, but he also is paying a lot of attention to the people in it. And I thought that observational aspect of his character was really pretty fascinating as well. With that character, I mean, alongside him is Florian. Can you kind of talk about who Florian is and like you talk about mirrors. I think Florian's like sort of an exact opposite in a lot of ways to Johann.
Yeah, well, Florian's a pretty opaque character. You sort of have to, like, you see a bit more of him later on, but you really have to, like, divine his intentions just from the drip of information he gives Johann. Yeah, so I talked before about how Frankenstein kind of bridges the gap between like Enlightenment thought and early modern thought. And that is the sort of evocation of how much like the idea of humanity as like rational beings, inherently good beings, just fell apart sort of, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, giving way to this period of like nihilism and irrationalism. That's very interesting to me. And it's why I set the story in something meant to evoke that early industrialized era. I'm really like fascinated by the specter of like something called the death drive. This is something that like Sabina Spielrein wrote about, and more famously Sigmund Freud expanded on like her theories. And that's like, the famous like sex death thing everyone talks about, like where Freud kind of posited that organisms, like humans specifically, have this desire, unconscious desire and urge towards death that drives what they do the same way that reproduction drives them. Freud eventually went to like extremely dark places with this, that I'm a pretty optimistic person. I don't like agree with this concept, but I am like endlessly fascinated by like, well, in a fantasy world, right? Like you could make something like that, like literally real. And it does kind of feel almost even in the real world, like you can speak horrible things into being. The cultural temperature can be very affected by like, well, what we're going through right now, like fake news.
Yeah.
Which, like, weirdly enough, sort of in the pre-World War I, pre-World War II era, there was like a pretty similar phenomena with like, mass dissemination of text. That's where you get the first sort of like major conspiracy theories like start like cropping up, because you just have people like, printing hundreds and hundreds of flyers, and, most people are not used to mass media. So we're kind of going through like a second stage of that. And being afloat in that a lot in the last like couple of years really inspired me to like finish this story. And Monster of Elendhaven is like a fantasy novel where that like sense that, a culture can almost desire like in a voyeuristic fashion its own destruction is quite literal. So Florian is like the equally reactionary backlash against that. So he's kind of like this wounded representation of like the old world. And he speaks sometimes in ways that seem almost like naturalistic or even borderline noble, like where he doesn't want to see like the mountain blown up to like have a train go through it. But when you kind of like scratch beneath the surface, there's like a huge sense of entitlement there. I would almost say Florian is like the thematic underpinnings of like Lord of the Rings, right? It's like that, but evil. Right.
Okay.
Like like Tolkien was very like anti-industrialization, but he was also like extremely into the divine right of kings.
Johann is the main POV character. I mean, it's like we're following him sort of third person through it. And then Florian gets flashbacks. Essentially, we don't see his direct point of view in the present day, and he keeps the things he's doing pretty close to the vest, even from Johann. So, I mean, what brought about that structure as far as having one character who's, driving this story, and then the other one where we're just getting glimpses into the background story?
I'm going to give another boring answer here. It just felt right to construct it that way. There's a certain point where I was just like, we need to know some of the backstory. And I thought that it didn't break sort of the conceit of having Florian be that opaque character because he has changed so much since he was like a kid. I always think it's neat when you sort of have something I like unreliable narrators. And so I always think it's neat when you kind of see something from one character's point of view and you, the reader, can pick up on details that character would never think to pick up on. There's a bit where Florian tells Johann not to call him Doc. And then when you go to the flashbacks in Johann's past, you find out that he wanted to be a doctor. And there's no underlining it, but I think it's cool to just put stuff out there for the reader to be able to kind of merge these two very unreliable narrators and get a clearer view, but maybe not a completely clear view of what's actually going on.
There is sort of a central mystery of what connects these two characters, as the story goes along. But I also felt like there were a number of places where both of those characters' backstories could have had what I would think of as sort of the Shyamalan twist, where there's places where reading it where I had the thought where I was like, oh, I could see where the twist could be here, but that would be a really bad idea. And I was really glad you didn't do it. Are you cognitive of what I'm talking about? Because I don't want to spoil anything here, but there's a couple of places.
I mean, I wrote the story the only way it could have been written, so I'm not sure what your horrifying Shyamalan twists are.
Yeah. So with those characters, though, I mean, we talked about this a little bit early on, and hinted at this, I should say, or early on. There's a romantic element between Johann and Florian, but I'm personally real uncomfortable with the idea of calling it a romance because it's an obsessive thing from Johann's standpoint. It is a manipulative thing from Florian's standpoint. There's often physical aggressions in it that are pretty non-consensual and at least for me, uncomfortable. And it felt to me at times like there were some real themes of dominance and submission that would go back and forth, where those situations would change back and forth as it went along. So in putting together a relationship like that in a story, knowing that these are two essentially evil characters who are, our main characters, and they have a very unhealthy look at everything in the world, really, but particularly each other. How do you put that together? How do you construct that and make that work as part of the story while not, going so far that it becomes alienating for the reader?
I do think actually that I did go far enough that I alienated some readers, not to reveal that I ever look at reviews or anything, but I sort of figured that this would be a bit of a divisive book because for the kind of people that reading about this kind of relationship, and I have a few friends who read it even before I went to tried to shop it around, who just were mind blown by it. They're just oh my God, I've wanted to pick something like this off the shelf for a while. But I think a lot of other people, it's very natural to kind of want resolution in romantic stories. So I didn't really think too much about whether or not I was going too far. I don't like to be cheap with my violence and cheap with non-consensual undertones. I think these things need to be treated seriously and with respect, even in something that Monster of Elendhaven veers into black comedy once in a while. But as I was sort of pretentiously explaining, right, Florian is the representation of the old world, the privileged nobility just clinging to that world by the fingernails. And Johann is kind of that voyeuristic glee that wants to see things get as bad as possible. The themes of the story actually grew out of the romance first. This was a very character first, relationship first book. I'm going to be honest, I just wanted to write the kind of dark love story that I like reading and don't see represented outside of fringe media or fanfic. I'm going to be honest, very often. I like that kind of uneasy alliances between people who are kind of star-crossed in the worst possible way. So I don't think that the purpose of fiction should always be resolution and to make you feel good. I think that there is a certain element in fiction where it's a little bit like getting on a roller coaster. You want to experience something very intense, very extreme, and then you want to be able to get off at the end. Literally get off the ride. That it's going to have terrible double entendre. Let me rephrase that.
I think you said it right the first time.
Okay, well, but for some people, yes. And I'm just sort of fascinated by my best friend and I call this high quality sociopath love. It's very particular kinds of relationships in which you have these very dangerous, very terrifying characters who just become utterly pathetic when they lose sort of like the shift of the power in the relationship, which you can see happening with Johann and Florian. Like, Johann does think he's like terrifying. He's never had to face consequences for his action, but he ends up just completely destroyed by being almost sweetly, deliriously in love in a very narcissistic way, because, you know, he is in love with Florian because this is the first person who's ever actually like literally looked at him and saw something. And I think that the final revelations of the book call into question whether Johann even had a choice to feel that way. So it's like the non-consensual aspect of the relationship is almost like two-pronged. It's like a very sick, destructive sinkhole that was always going to collapse in on itself. And in that way, it's like becomes a microcosm of the society they live in. So I think that what the relationship ended up being is a way to understand on the small scale what could potentially happen to the society it's depicting on the large scale.
I thought it was interesting to see that in some of their marketing for this, Tor.com actually used a lot of the AO3 tags.
They've been doing that for a couple of the books. I really like it.
I'm not a fan fiction reader, and I'm only like passingly familiar with Archive of Our Own. But I do think it's been interesting, really, ever since I started this podcast and kind of got deeper into, I've always been a big reader, but the online book community is seeing how conscious a lot of the readers are of trope, far more so than maybe I would have expected. Like if you go to Take Yourself to Goodreads or those places where discussions are happening, where you know, people do have a lot more conception these days of trope. And oftentimes I think it's because they have found the ones they like and they keep seeking them out. Me as a reader, I don't have that compulsion, but it does seem to be very prevalent that a lot of readers are actively looking for, I'm looking for these beats to be hit. So I thought that was interesting that they were using those AO3 tags. One of them that I saw them use was hurt, no comfort. And I get how that fits with the story, but I don't know exactly what that means in relationship to it.
I mean, like, her comfort is actually probably like my least favorite genre of like fan fiction. I fucking hate her comfort fic. So like comfort is just like there's a lot of pain, usually in a relationship in specific, or someone in the relationship gets hurt a lot, and you're made to feel very, very, very badly. And especially if you're talking in fanfic in ways that just can sometimes be like rough and violent in ways that you would not normally see in like a mainstream book that wasn't trying to make like a deep intellectual point, you know? And then you get the comfort at the end, you know, you get like the fluff that kind of like makes up for it and everyone gets taken care of. I just like, I'm not saying this is bad or anything. It's just not something I personally like. And the joke there was that like, you know, Monster of Elendhaven is technically a love story. Like, you know, it is in a lot of ways a romance, but it's like there is no comfort at the end. It's just the knife just twists harder.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, that makes sense then. That contextualizes. Yeah, because I wasn't sure what the no comfort part meant, and that's spot on with it. I want to talk about craft and process here for a minute. Are you an outliner, a pantser? Like how detailed? You kind of said from that your first draft of it, you kind of had already figured out the language of it, and you know, sort of the prose style. But what's your process for constructing the story?
I think about things really hard for a couple days or a couple months. Listening to music. I didn't have an outline for this story actually, but that's just because I wrote it in kind of a bizarre way. I wrote like, I'd say the first 5,000 to 6,000 words of it at Clarion when I went to Clarion West in 2013. And then I just shelved it for years. And then I came back to it and like figured out the ending. But when I'm writing like longer stories, I do outline, but I have very, very rough outlines. I always know what like the first line and the last line of a story are. And then I give myself a lot of space to breathe, to expand things. But I always know where I'm going.
Do you have a specific structural plotting method that you use? Like whether it's 3-act, 4-act structure or story circle or save the cat or any of those kinds of things?
Oh, no.
You're just wandering through the dark until it comes together?
I mean, I'm sure I tend to think of things a lot in like terms of writing an essay. So it's like when you want to break down an essay, right? It's like your 3 paragraphs, but then you kind of like break it out from there, right? So it's like your first, like if you're writing like a longer form essay in which you need more than 3 paragraphs, it's like every part of your essay should have the like introduction, the argument, and the like conclusion, right? So I think I just haven't taken like a lot of writing courses. So I like literally, I probably do use some of these methods, but it's like I don't really have like a name for it. I'm a lot more inspired by my time writing history essays, weirdly, in terms of how I like plan something. Because it's like when you're writing a history essay, you do all your research and you get all your quotes, and then you put all your quotes in a big document, and then you form everything around those quotes. So it's like I tend to think of things as having like, what is the core thematic binding of this story? And then how can I tie everything to that? And I kind of like plot things along like character introductions and like climaxes rather than using any sort of like more traditional. Yeah.
In a 150-page novella, I mean, how quickly do you need to hit the inciting incident? How fast do you need to get the gears turning in order to get everything done in the amount of time that you have?
I'm not sure if you need the inciting incident actually as fast as you do in a novel. One of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got, once again at Clarion, from Samuel R. Delaney. He told our class that the longer a story is, the more simplistic a through line it needs to have. But like short stories can experiment with like, form and structure a lot more, which like seems a little counterintuitive until you kind of really think about it. Because if you don't have a simple through line in like, say, a 600-page fantasy novel, you're going to lose the plot like really quickly and just go off on a bunch of tangents that don't matter. So I feel like Monster of Elendhaven actually has a pretty lazy pacing. Like, there's not really any point where things kind of ramp up. It's just like, always try to make sure, like, every time I have, like, a chapter break, something happens. Like, you learn something. Like, the first chapter, it's like you learn who Johann is. The second chapter, Johann and Florian meet. The third chapter, you, like, see Florian start to do his experiments, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I think it really depends on how you want people, and like something as short as a novella, like how you want people to experience that story.
I like that you hit on there. Like, short stories and novellas do have that ability to be far more experimental. I think partially because they're lower commitment for the reader. You're not sitting down with a 1,000-page epic fantasy tome or something that's going to consume your life for X number of days or weeks. And I think there's a certain forgiveness in the shorter formats for not having to explain everything. Like the longer a story goes on, the more the mechanics need to make sense, the more they need to work, the more that people are going to question. If it's hard sci-fi, they're going to be like, how does the faster than light system works? I need to know. And if it's a fantasy story, they're like, how does the magic system work? I need to know. But in a short story, generally speaking, there's forgiveness for those things. And I think particularly horror, I think horror trades on this in a big way because they've discovered that like if you explain too much with horror, it's not horrific anymore.
Oh yeah, the absolute worst thing you can do in a horror story is just fucking explain like what the scary noise is.
Right, yeah. It's the fear of what we don't understand, the fear of what's in the dark that we can't see is what makes that work in horror. And I think in shorter speculative fiction, you get an opportunity to play with those concepts the way horror does. And I think you do that with this, where you're explaining things and you're giving stuff. And by the end of it, we have a very firm idea of who these characters are and what kind of formed them. But at the same time, it's still fuzzy enough around the edges. It's still dark enough around the outside of them that we don't feel like we know everything. We know just enough, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That was my goal, and I'm glad that I achieved it.
What are your tools of the trade? What do you write in?
I do a lot of freehand writing. Just like when I get writer's block, I will go somewhere with no internet and a notebook, and I will write as fast as I can, which is nice because it always gives you the added bonus of like basically having a second draft of your prose when you go to type it up. But I mean, like most people, I do most of my writing on my laptop.
Do you use any particular software for it?
Yeah, I just use Google Docs. Or like Notepad sometimes.
Oh my God, Notepad?
Yeah, I actually have a friend who still does all of her creative writing in Notepad. It's crazy.
That just made my like OCD flare up in like a huge way. I'm kind of freaked out and head spinny about that. I feel dizzy.
It's another thing that comes from like old school fandom practices, because back in the day you had to do all your HTML coding for fic on your own. Like there was no tools in any of the major fanfic sites to like do rich text editing. So like a lot of people my age just kind of grew up writing in Notepad.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I never thought about that contextually. Yeah, that's interesting. Before we finish up here, what other stories and media are you consuming right now?
Oh, goodness. Let me think of what I've read this year that wasn't like a depressing nonfiction book. I have, of course, been reading Gideon the Ninth, which I see you have a copy of in the back, by my friend Tamsin.
Yep.
It's been a long time since I've read something that just like really made me excited to work on my own doorstopper of a manuscript. It is like just beautiful, inspiring, like wacky fantasy novel. The thing that's really blowing my mind right now is probably Jonathan Hickman's current run on X-Men. He has the book for about 3 years. He just started. Every single issue of his introductory miniseries has been like mind-blowing in the sense that it's high concept in the truest definition of the term. It is just completely upending and like reinvigorating the entire conceit that X-Men is built on. And like I have not been this excited to read comics probably in like 10 years. So if anyone likes superhero comics, I recommend that. And I've just been listening to a lot of Michael Duncan's Revolution podcasts. Michael Duncan's like a historian who he did like a really famous Rome podcast, like just did the entire like history of the Roman Empire. It was one of the really early, like formative history podcasts, but he's been doing one for the past couple of years where he just covers different revolutions. It's dry. It's a little dry if you don't like history, but like nothing gets me more amped up creatively than like hearing about revolutions. So if you're into history, I guess I would also recommend that. I've been replaying Final Fantasy VII because everyone's talking about it again because of the...
They're remaking it, right?
Yeah,
they're going to do a modern port of it?
Yeah, which I'm like not super excited about, but I have been excited to revisit the original game because it's interesting to go... Because like I played that game when I was like 10, so it's interesting to go back and just see how much that game's like incredibly careful like balance of absurd humor and just like dark, almost Lovecraftian horror really inspired me.
Yeah, I think it's something that modern writers, we see so much more influence from video games, from anime, from comics. I mean, comics have had a huge impact for a long time, but like I feel like literary tradition would be less like open to talking about it in the past, whereas like genre writers now are far more open about that storytelling for them is massively affected by all of these other sources. It's
interesting too because you can kind of see like the generational turnover where you've sort of had the that first generation of like I guess you would call like late Gen X fantasy writers who grew up on like the really early Final Fantasy games or Dragon Quest, and now you're seeing the shift over into people who grew up on like the PS1 and the N64 era games, and it's just like really interesting seeing the very mild shift in themes and like the way stories are approached and the kind of characters that are written that are still inspired by like technically the exact same game series.
And then as we wrap up, where should people be following you online? Where should they find out what's happening with you?
I just have a Twitter. My Twitter is under my AO3 name, Cyphead Variable. I will spell that if you need me to.
I will put it on the show page, but for people who are just listening, I have no idea what those words are, so please spell.
A Cyphead variable is a type of star that when you look at it, it appears to twinkle. I don't even remember why, but they are what astronomers use when they're doing triangulation to like figure out galactic distances. So it's CEPHIEDVARIABLE.
So that's the one place that you are online. Well, you've got a website too, right?
Yeah. My website is just jennifergiesbrecht.com, and I don't use any other social media.
That's healthy. Well, awesome. So as I mentioned at the top, Monster of Eldenhaven is a novella that is coming out, I believe, in hardcover. Because the Tor.coms are all in these like beautiful hardcover. It has an amazing cover from Jeffrey Allen Love.
Oh, it's beautiful. I'm still surprised about the hardcover thing.
It's such a cool way to present those stories. And Tor.com is just putting out some really fascinating stories that are maybe not in the mainstream enough. So I think that's really awesome. Like I said, comes out September 24th. And Jennifer, thank you for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Season 4, Episode 10 of Fictitious. Every episode of the show is available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with news and events, articles, and more. Listen and subscribe to Fictitious on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or search for the show using your favorite app. Stay connected on Twitter or Instagram, where you'll find us as @FictitiouSPod. You can also chat about story, media, or anything else with me on my personal account @AdrianBusky. If you enjoy Fictitious, please share this episode on your favorite social network, tell your book-loving friends, or write us a review. It all supports the authors who appear on the show, and you'll help me to grow the podcast. Next week, I'm joined by Annalee Newitz, author of the unique and twisty time travel novel, The Future of Another Timeline. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.